Today we have a mailbag. We'll be talking Zach Wilson, the waiver wire, the Ring of Honor, and more on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, June 10th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit that subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give the episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out and helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. This podcast is currently in off-season mode, so doing sporadic podcasts. We'll try and get it up in the weeks ahead. I'll try and do a little bit more than I've been doing. But today we have our weekly mailbag. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. And we begin. Our first question is about the waiver wire. Knowing the Jets hold a top waiver claim position, what positions do you think Joe Douglas would be looking at during roster countdowns? What players would he be more inclined to try and trade for because they would not get past a Jaguars, Lions, or Texans waiver claim? So first I want to go into a little bit of an explanation about what the waiver wire is. At this point in time, now the rules change once you get deeper into the season, but at this point in time, what happens to you after you're cut depends on how much experience you have in the league. If you have played for more than 4 years in the NFL and you get cut by your team, you're a free agent. You can sign with any team you want. You can sign for a new amount of money. Your contract essentially is gone. If you have less than 4 years of experience, though, you go to the waiver wire. And this is true, again, this is true through the end of training camp. So guys who get cut and don't make their team's initial 53-man roster, they have to go through the waiver wire process if they have less than 4 years of experience. And essentially what the waiver wire process allows you to do is it allows all 31 teams to try and claim you. And if you claim a player who was waived, you get the player and you take on his full contract. So he does not get to choose which team he signs with. He is still playing on his old contract. You essentially take the player's contract. Essentially, I'd say it's kind of like trading for a player and giving up nothing. Now, if more than one team puts in a claim for a player, that's when the waiver wire order comes into play. And essentially, it's the same as the draft order. So the team that had the worst record last year, the team with a higher draft pick, has a higher claim in the waiver wire process. So let's say the Jets put in a claim against Jacksonville. Well, Jacksonville picked number one overall. So if both the Jets and the Jaguars claim a player, Jacksonville gets him because Jacksonville has the higher waiver wire claim. Now, one other thing I'm going to point out for you fantasy football players, that order stays the same until the regular season begins, until we get a couple weeks into the regular season. So if you play fantasy football, you may be used to like a waiver wire process where you have the top claim, but then once you if you claim a player off waivers, you go to the back of the line. That's not how the NFL works. After a couple weeks of the season, the order changes and it's based on team's record. But through the offseason, it stays the same. It doesn't matter how many players you claim. It's the draft order. So the Jets have priority over every team except for Jacksonville, except for Detroit, and except for Houston. So if the Jets put in a claim on a player, they're going to get him unless Jacksonville, Houston, or Detroit claims that same player. So that's a little bit of background on this. Now let's get to the actual question. What positions do you think the Jets will be interested in claiming players? And I don't know it's going to be as based on position as you might think, because you have to remember, the Jets are essentially trying to improve their roster everywhere. And players who are claimed off waivers, I mean, listen, you can get a good player. You can get somebody who eventually turns into a good player off the waiver wire process. The last couple of years, Jets got John Franklin Myers. They got Braxton Berrios. They got Quincy Williams. Those are three very successful waiver wire claims. But generally speaking, you're getting guys who have a pretty low shot of ever developing into contributors for your team. And really what you're looking to do, you're not looking for starters. I mean, if a guy develops into a starter like a John Franklin Myers, that's great, but that's the exception to the rule. Most guys who don't make their team's 53-man roster, they're not going to be good players. But what they can be is they might be an upgrade over your backup or your third-string guy somewhere. And that's really what you're looking to do. You're looking to improve your depth, and you're looking to find somebody who could be a decent developmental player for you. But I don't know that you're necessarily like targeting specific. Now, I think there are certain positions where the Jets obviously need more help than others. They need a run-stopping defensive tackle. Will one become available who's of any caliber? I don't know, but they might be able to find somebody who's an upgrade over what they have. Jets need some linebacker depth. Jets probably could use some safety depth, depending on how some young guys develop at the safety position. So, like, those would be the positions where I could see it happening. You might see it at tackle, but I mean, if any tackle who's going to be useful, even like a third swing tackle, I don't know that player is going to be cut by his initial team. So I think it has less to do with position. I think obviously if position where you're weaker, you're more likely to make a claim, and those are the three that come to mind are run stopping defensive tackle, linebacker, and safety. But I think it's going to be more of a holistic thing. They're just going to look for who's better than our backup or our third string guy at this position. Now, are the Jets more likely to make a trade for players at a certain position than others? I don't know that you trade for players who are going to be cut by their team, because you have to remember, if a guy's being cut, he's not a starter. He's probably at the back of his team's roster. So I don't know that you trade for waiver wire players. In fact, a few years back, Joe Douglas traded a late round pick for Alex Lewis right when the Ravens were going to cut him, and that did not make a lot of sense to me, because the Jets were at the very top of the waiver wire process, so they probably would have gotten Lewis anyway. And the thing is, like, even if you don't get a player, even if, let's say, Jacksonville claims a player, again, it's a player who was put on waivers, probably not going to be a great player. There are always the exceptions, but the odds are against any player being useful who's on the waiver wire. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and of course, like, giving up a 6th-round pick is not the end of the world. In fact, 6th-round picks, there are some studies that will tell you 6th-round picks are less useful than they are less useful for picking players than they are for trading for established players. But I'd still rather hold the pick and maybe trade it. If you're going to trade for a player, make it a guy who's got a proven track record, not somebody who's being put on waivers. So I mean, it's possible. I don't think the Jets are really going to use the waiver wire in that way, though. I mean, I could always be wrong, but I don't know that I see that happening. I think when you're talking waiver wire, it's an important thing. It's one of those things that shows you whether your team's doing the proper work, because every couple of years you want to find a decent player, a good role player, and the Jets, to their credit, have done that the last couple of years. But I don't know that it's going to be an essential role for filling the core of your roster. Our next question. I looked at some of the initial fantasy football rankings that came out, and on average there appear to be no Jets in the top 50. Only a few in the top 150, and no Jets in the top 15 for any position. I think a lot of us may be getting carried away, thinking that the offense is on the verge of breaking out. May it be more fair and reasonable to say that this offense may be on the verge of improving from awful to okay or not terrible, which, by the way, would be a significant improvement. What do you think? Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the Jets are obviously going to be very young on the offensive side of the ball at a lot of the skill positions. I mean, 2 of your top 3 receivers are going to be guys in year 1 or 2. Your quarterback's entering year 2. 2 running backs in the first or second season. A lot of it's based on projection. And, of course, in the offseason, you get very excited with what your team does. I mean, I think all 32 fan bases, I mean, maybe there's 1 or 2 who just like hated everything their team did in the offseason, but almost every fan base thinks that their team got a lot better during the offseason. A lot of it's based on projection for the Jets because you're going with guys who are so young. I think those rankings tend to skew for guys who have proven it before. They don't really do a lot of projecting about who's going to break out. If you're the Jets, you need a lot of guys to be breakout players for your team. You need guys who have not produced in the past to put up numbers that they haven't proven it yet. There's potential there, but they haven't proven it yet. And that's why I think a lot of these rankings are a little bit lower on the Jets. And I expressed throughout much of the offseason, I expressed my preference that the Jets go out and get somebody established at receiver, which of course they did not do. And it's always a risk when you're depending on players. Now, the upside scenario is very high for the Jets, because if these guys do break out, and every year you see players break out, you see players perform at levels they have not in the past, then you have a guy producing at a high level who's a significant discount because you got them through the draft. And then you can start talking about building something special. But it's one of those things. I think every fan base believes that their players are just on the verge of breaking out. I think every fan base believes, at this point of the year, you always tend to assume that the best case scenario for your team is going to play out. And sometimes it does, but I think it is fair. I think it's fair to look at this and say, there's potential here, but there are also some question marks whenever you're dealing with players who are not as established. It's there's always a bit of a gamble there. It's always it's more difficult to project young players who are less established than it is to project veteran players who have a proven track record. So yeah, I think it's possible though that these guys could break out, and that's really what's not being considered in these rankings, because the rankings, I think, tend to just focus on what have you done in the past. They're not looking to make predictions about. They're not going to make a prediction that somebody's going to take a huge leap, but that does sometimes happen. So that's the hopeful case for the Jets. And with this young roster, if you get a couple of these guys hitting, this team's going to get a lot better very quickly. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will continue on this mailbag show. We'll talk about the Ring of Honor. The Jets recently made an announcement about 3 players who will be entering the prestigious club this year. That's ahead here on this Friday special mailbag episode. Well, it's the NFL offseason. The Jets are in their offseason program. In a few weeks, they will be beginning training camp. You can still place prop bets, though, on the next NFL season at BetOnline. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports info. Find all of the latest sports development news and odds, including this year's basketball NBA Finals, the NHL Conference Finals. Rangers, once again, with their backs against the wall, facing elimination. We've heard that story before. You got Major League Baseball, and of course the latest fighting news from MMA and UFC, all the way to boxing. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, and we continue with our mailbag show. Our next question: D'Brickashaw, Ferguson, Nick Mangold, and Darrelle Revis are slated to be inducted into the Jets Ring of Honor. Are there any Jets yet to be inducted that you would like to see included? Well, here's the one, and I could give you a couple of guys, but here's the thing that's odd to me. So, and listen, D'Brickashaw, Ferguson, Nick Mangold, Darrelle Revis, they all belong. It's great that they're going in. And it's fitting that they're all going. Now, the Jets are doing this. They're inducting each player in a different game. So three players going in this year, 3 different games instead of putting them all in at once. And I'm guessing that's to like sell tickets, because if you have all 3 of them at one game, that's the game everybody's going to want to go to. If you have one Ferguson game, one Mangold game, one Revis game, people are going to want to go to 3 different games. So I'm guessing that has to do with it. And if you look at, that was kind of, these were 3 of the players who were the core of some really good Jets teams. You know, Mangold was drafted 06. Ferguson was drafted 06, actually, before Mangold. Revis was drafted 07. And these were like the homegrown core of those teams that went to the AFC Championship game under Rex Ryan. But there was a 4th player drafted in that span, David Harris, who I think is a Ring of Honor player. And I think it's so fitting that D'Brickashaw and Mangold and Revis are going in together, because they were such a part of a great era of Jets football. But I think it's odd that David Harris is not part of that mix. And I know David Harris, his peak may not have been as high as those other guys, but to me, he's a great Jet. To me, he's a Ring of Honor player. So, I mean, I think that's a guy who clearly comes to mind for me. Dave, it seemed like the most obvious thing in the world. These guys were like the 4 players who were linked together forever. So David Harris, to me, that's the guy who comes to mind just based on what they're doing this year. And I find it a little bit odd that they didn't put him in with. I think to me, David Harris. I mean, I guess there are people. His case for the Ring of Honor, I guess, is not as high as the other players, but to me, he's a Ring of Honor player. He's a great Jet. So I could come up with a lot of names, but to me, just based on who they picked this year, all of whom are worthy. And listen, do not take this to mean that I disagree with any of the 3 players going in this year. These are all guys who are slam dunk choices, but David Harris to me is the guy who I think should go in. Our next question: Are Jets fans being too conservative in their expectations for Zach Wilson this season? If a quarterback is going to be good, he would normally show it by his second season. Well, I guess the question is, what do you mean by expectations? Because depending on who you speak with, expectations can be all over the place. I think Zach, well, I do agree that I think a quarterback, if he hasn't shown it by the second season, the odds really kind of become stacked against him. What are the expectations for Zach Wilson? I think Zach Wilson can be a good quarterback in this league. I don't think it's out of the question. I think that the expectations that he's the next Mahomes, that might be a bit too high based on what we saw his rookie season. I think that maybe some of the expectations that were put on him when he entered the league weren't fair, because pretty much any quarterback, if you're asking him to be the next Rodgers or the next Mahomes, it's probably not going to happen. It's one of those things when you find a player like that, that can never be the expectation. It's one of those things where you're trying to find a good player. And if they turn into something special, then you have to be very happy with that. But Zach Wilson doesn't need to be that to be a successful pick for the Jets. I talked about this a few weeks ago, that I think we underestimate the value of a guy who's just a quality quarterback, a guy who could do the job effectively. And to me, this season, if Zach Wilson goes out there and he looks like he knows how to make the reads, he looks like he knows how to put the ball accurately, he looks like a guy who's comfortable planting that back foot, being decisive in the pocket. To me, that's a huge step forward, and I think the Jets have done a decent job building around him. And I go back to this run game that I think is going to help him a lot. I think the run game is really going to simplify things for Zach. I think he's got to show something this year. I think if Zach Wilson does not look like a quality quarterback, I'm not saying he's got to look like a top 10 quarterback. I think going from where Zach Wilson was as a rookie in 2021 to the top 10, that is a very long trip. That's a lot to ask. But I do think he has to look the part by the end of this year, or we may have to assess where things are. Next question: should the NFL look to add a dress code for coaches and ban hoodies? In the NHL, the coaches are all wearing suits. Well, it's interesting you say that, because in the last couple of years, as far as sports go, the dress code has become much more lax. And I'm thinking basketball in particular, because in basketball, coaches used to be wearing suits all the time, and you've seen that less since 2020. And I don't know that that's going back. So it seems to me like in sports, the dress code's become less formal for coaches. Now in baseball, you have guys wearing uniforms. In football, you have guys wearing sweats. And I think back, if you go back decades and decades, coaches used to wear suits on the sidelines. And I think back 15 years, the 49ers had a coach, Mike Nolan, who wanted to wear a suit, and the NFL wouldn't let him. And then eventually, there was some compromise where Reebok made a custom suit that he was allowed to wear in 2 games. So as far as I know, they're actually not allowed to wear suits. I think there was some compromise with Mike Nolan that allowed him to wear it a couple of times in one season. So I think there actually is, the dress code actually doesn't allow coaches to wear suits right now. Should they? I mean, I always like the view of Lombardi on the sideline in a suit, so I don't hate the idea of putting coaches in suits, but I don't know that the league's going to go in that direction. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out this weekly mailbag. We will talk about how important Zach Wilson's development is for Joe Douglas's job security. That's ahead here on this Friday episode. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We continue with our mailbag show. Our next question: if Zach does not become the franchise quarterback he was drafted to be, do you think Joe Douglas gets another shot at finding a quarterback? Or is Douglas a goner if Zach doesn't work out? I think he's done a good job and would like to see him get another crack at it if Zach is not our quarterback of the future. Well, I think it's true not just of Joe Douglas, but of any general manager. Your fate is typically tied to your quarterback. I don't think it's a 100% correlation. I think that there are scenarios where Joe Douglas could survive if Zach and get his second chance at the quarterback if Zach Wilson does not pan out. But I think it's probably 90 to 95%. If Zach Wilson is the guy, Joe Douglas stays. If Zach Wilson isn't the guy, Joe Douglas goes. I think the scenario where Douglas survives would be if he just hit on all of his other draft picks. If, Elijah Moore turns into a number 1 receiver. And if Breece Hall looks as good as advertised. If Garrett Wilson looks as good as advertised. If Sauce Gardner is a shutdown corner. And you have this core of young talent. To me, that the Jets would probably... And this always goes back to whether or not you win games. We always kind of separate winning games, but if those things happen, the Jets will probably win enough games or they could win enough games to buy Joe Douglas some more time. But the most important aspect of winning games is how your quarterback plays. And that's usually, I think that's the biggest reason why general managers don't survive it when their hand-picked quarterback fails. And we could talk about this because, the more you think about it, it's kind of ridiculous that one pick should define whether you keep your job or not. And quarterback's a very difficult position to scout. And we could go into, this guy has a lot of different angles we could go to, and we could probably discuss it at more points in this offseason. But it's just crazy that your entire career depends on something as inexact as picking a quarterback. Picking a quarterback's really hard. Getting that right's really hard. So should it? I think probably not. Will it? It's kind of the way the NFL works. I look at the NFL. It's kind of the way I approach the NFL. Should this happen is very different from will this happen. And I think that the most likely scenario is that if Zach Wilson does not pan out, Joe Douglas does not keep his job. But there are scenarios. It's not as specific yes or no. It's just more of like I'd say like a 90 to 95% shot. Our next question: do you plan on seeing Jurassic World Dominion opening night? And if so, can we get an emergency podcast with your review? Well, I don't know if there's a Locked On Jurassic Park podcast, so I mean, maybe I could volunteer to host that. I will not go opening night. I usually try and avoid like opening night crowd. Actually, like my go-to movie time is like the Saturday matinee, because like I hate getting to the theater early. Like I don't want to sit around for 20 minutes before the previews begin, because the previews go on another 15 minutes. So like my ideal scenario when I go to the movies is I like to, stop by the refreshment stand, get my popcorn, get my soda, walk in as previews are playing. But if you go opening night to a big box office hit, you really struggle to find a seat. It's really tricky. So I like when the theater's a little bit more sparsely populated. I like it when I have a chance to kind of spread out, find a good spot on my own. So I will not be going opening. I usually don't go opening night. Usually I wait a week or two to go. And again, I've kind of come to like the Saturday matinee because I find the theaters aren't that crowded then. And I was thinking this through. I don't think I've been to a movie since COVID, but yes, I am going Jurassic Park because it's one of those things that it's there's only one of two options. Either my expectations for this movie are so low because I think this movie is like the ultimate monument to Hollywood greed. The fact, this movie, why did this movie need to be made? So it's either going to be great to make fun of, or maybe they'll surprise me. Maybe my expectations are so low that like it'll actually be better than I expected, in which case I'll get a decent movie. So yeah, I'm going though. I will be going maybe a week or two, so please no spoilers in the comments. The reviews I've read is that this movie's every bit as bad as I'm expecting it to be, but who knows? It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And our last question, John, most other Jets seasons have felt heading into them like some previous one from the last 40 years or so, but this one seems particularly unique. Do you have any intuition or gut feel yet, or do you normally wait until training camp to sense the vibes? Well, I think in training camp, the vibes are always optimistic. I mean, the Tebow year, the Jets thought they were going to revolutionize offense in the NFL. Every year, the Jets tell you they're going to be great. I think it's different from the standpoint that the Jets have committed to a real rebuild this time. They have not done that in the past. Like the Jets have thrown the word out rebuilding a lot in recent years, but like they've never really committed to it until building a roster around a young core. And that doesn't guarantee that you're going to have success. These guys could be, these draft picks could end up not being very good, but they've at least like really committed to trying to do it this way. And I think that that's exciting. I think you have a lot of homegrown young players. We just earlier in the show, we talked about Revis and Mangold and DeBrickashaw. And those were our guys for a long time. And there are lots of players that Jets have drafted the last couple of years. You could see a scenario a few years down. Those will be our guys, and that's exciting. So I don't know how good the Jets are going to be this year. I don't know if they're a playoff team. I don't know how many games they're going to win, but I think there should be reason for optimism. That's a little bit. There's always optimism, but I think the optimism should be a little bit different this year because you have a group who could be like the next great homegrown core of the Jets. That's all for our show today. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit that subscribe button, give the episode a big thumbs up. Have a great weekend, everybody. Again, no Jurassic Park spoilers. We'll be back next week.